Good evening, friends. Tonight, let's travel back to a Viking winter, long, dark, and cold in the most creative way imaginable. How did they get through months of barely seeing the sun? The answer is warmer and a little more flavorful than you might think. Now dim the lights and let's drift into tonight's story with the sound of bells. You're standing in an open meadow. The air smells of damp earth and withered grass, heavy with a dull, pale grey sky. Thick clouds hang low, as if ready to collapse at any moment. Every breath you exhale forms a tiny white cloud in front of you, vanishing quickly in the cold wind. The wind carries a premonition, a sharp, northern chill you've never felt before. Everyone around you is bustling, moving as if racing an invisible enemy. Men shout as they drag the last load of firewood from the woods, piling it beside the longhouse until it towers like a small hill. Women bend low, hastily harvesting the last root vegetables from the fields and tossing them into wicker baskets. Even the children are helping, their small figures darting between the adults, bundling loose hay into neat stacks. Suddenly, someone points to the sky. You look up and see a tiny white flake swirling gently down. Then a second, a third, more and more. The first snow has arrived, you announced. The crowd falls silent for a breath. Everyone pauses, staring upward, their faces a mix of awe, resignation, and acceptance. You know this snow is a signal. The outdoor world, the world of sun, soil, and sea is officially over. Shh, hurry, get the sheep inside, a tall man calls, his beard dusted with frost. He waves at you, and you hurry to join the group, herding a flock of sheep and a few reluctant cows toward a large, low-slung building nearby. This is your home and your sanctuary. The animals are led to one end of the longhouse, where thick hay covers the floor. Their restlessness and scent immediately add a complex warmth to the cold days. This was the Vikings' first winter wisdom, sharing a roof with their livestock. The animals not only found shelter, but their large bodies radiated heat, becoming one of the longhouse's natural heating systems. You follow the crowd to carry the last supplies inside baskets of dark, brick-like objects. Curious, you pick one up. It's light, rough-textured, and smells faintly of hay. Not unpleasant. A young boy stacking the bricks notices your expression and grins. That's the good stuff. We couldn't get through winter without it, he says. You realize these are fuel bricks. All summer, people had collected animal dung, mixed it with hay, pressed it into bricks, and dried them in the sun, in an era when wood was reserved for building and tools. These unassuming dung bricks were the most steady, long-lasting source of warmth in the hearth. They burned with little smoke, but plenty of heat, each family's lifeline through the winter. As you work, you overhear two older men talking quietly nearby. This snow came too early, one says. It's like Fimbulwinter is upon us. And the other shakes his head. Don't be foolish, that's just a myth. You lean in, familiar with the term Fimbulwinter. It comes from ancient legends, a terrible, endless winter that precedes Ragnarok, the end of the world, a 3-year freeze that covers everything in ice and snow. Of course, everyone knows it's just a story, but behind that myth lies a faint echo of real history. Around the 6th century, shortly before the Viking Age, the Earth experienced a severe mini-ice age. Volcanic eruptions darkened the sky, temperatures plummeted, and widespread famine and death followed. This terrible collective memory likely inspired the myth of Fimbulwinter. For the people around you, every early snowfall, every unusually sharp wind, felt like a gentle knock on the door to that ancient fear. Winter was not just cold, it was a beast lurking in the depths of their cultural memory. Now, all preparations are done. The heavy wooden door closes behind you, shutting out the wind, snow, and light. The world shrinks instantly. You push open the thick door, and a rich mix of smoke, sweat, livestock, and stewed meat washes over you, making you blink. The door slams shut behind you, like a dividing line pulling you completely from the cold, silent white world, outside into a warm, dim, and noisy realm. This is the inside of the Longhouse, the entire universe you'll live in for the next few months. Your eyes take a moment to adjust to the light. The Longhouse is extremely long, like an upturned ship, with an arched roof designed, they say, to better bear the weight of snow and circulate heat inside. There are no interior walls, just a vast, endless corridor. The only steady light comes from a long sunken hearth in the center of the floor, where flames dance tirelessly, licking at several large pots hanging above. The firelight stretches people's shadows long across the wooden walls and thatched roof, flickering like living things. You walk along the path beside the hearth, your feet pressing into the hard-packed earth. Near the door, stone slabs line the floor to keep mud from being tracked inside. On either side of the hearth are 2 rows of long, raised wooden platforms, all benches. During the day, people sit here to work, eat, and talk. At night, covered with furs and blankets, these become beds. Right now, the benches are full men, women, and children, almost everyone with something to do. Women spin thread, children chase each other, and men polish their tools. The air is filled with sounds, a baby's cry, people's chatter, the hum of spinning wheels, and the occasional lowing of cattle and sheep from the other end. There is almost no privacy here. Everyone's life is exposed to everyone else's sight and hearing. You look up, searching for a way for the smoke to escape. Surprisingly, this huge house has no chimney. How does all the smoke get out? You follow the swirling smoke toward the highest point of the roof and spot 2 small openings, one on either side of the ridge. Cold air enters through one, pushing the hot air and smoke inside into a steady current that exits through the other. It's an ingeniously simple passive ventilation system. They're called wind eyes in Old Norse, an old man tells you. Later, the word made its way into English and became what we now call windows. So what you're seeing is arguably the oldest window in the world, though it doesn't let in light, only wind and smoke. You walk to the wall and touch it, The longhouse walls are made of thick wooden planks, their gaps stuffed with moss and hay to keep out the wind. But in areas where wood was scarce, like Iceland, the Viking settlers built longhouses with an older, warmer material, turf. They would lay a stone foundation, then stack thick turf bricks like blocks, creating walls up to 2 meters thick. These turf houses were incredibly warm, like fortresses grown from the earth. This longhouse was like an ark anchored in an endless winter. Outside, the cold and darkness could freeze anything. Inside, it was filled with the warmth of life. The central hearth was its heart, beating out light and heat for everyone. Every person, every animal living here was a passenger on this ark, together braving the storms of the world outside. It was more than a home. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem, a warm vessel that carried an entire clan, their cultural memories and their stories safely through the winter. Survival here was not an individual struggle, but an organized, collective stand. You take a deep breath. This mix of scents, the smell of life itself, is the smell of winter. Today, a strong cold front has swept down from the north. The wind howls outside like a beast. Even though the hearth burns brightly, you can still feel a chill seeping in through the door cracks and wall gaps. You need to go to a nearby storehouse to fetch something. And that means venturing into the world of ice and snow. This is not something to take lightly. Getting dressed is a serious technical task. You walk to your sleeping spot and begin the complex, methodical process of arming yourself against the cold. First, the undergarments. You pick up a long-sleeved linen shirt called a shift. Linen is not as warm as wool, but it's much softer against the skin, absorbing sweat to keep you dry. In an era without cotton, linen was a luxury. Some wealthy people even deliberately made their shifts with longer sleeves and hems than their outer clothes, so a hint of white linen would show as they moved, quietly showing off their ability to afford 2 layers of clothing. You slip it on, feeling the cool, smooth linen against your skin. Next, the main warmth, wool. You pull on a thick woolen tunic, loose-fitting and much heavier than the linen shift. Wool was the Vikings' ultimate weapon against the cold. Not only was it warm, but it retained some of its insulation, even when wet, a crucial feature in the snow and ice-covered north. Your tunic is deep red, dyed with the roots of a plant called madder. Its color bright and long-lasting. Around the neck and cuffs, a colorful woven band made with tablet weaving adorns it, patterned with geometric designs. It's both decoration and a symbol of status. For your lower half, you put on loose woolen trousers. The exact style of Viking trousers has long been a subject of debate. Very few textile fragments have survived, so we can only guess from vague illustrations. Some scholars believe loose, knickerbocker-style trousers were popular, easy for movement. Others, citing archaeological finds, argue that tight-fitting trousers also existed, better to show off the legs. There's even a theory that some trousers were attached to socks, like tights. Surely a challenge to put on and take off. Your trousers are loose, but tapered at the ankles to tuck into your boots. Then comes the most distinctive, and perhaps oddest, part of your outfit. Two long, roughly 10-centimeter, wide woolen strips, leg wrappings, starting just below your knees. You wind the strips tightly around your calves, all the way down to your ankles, tucking the ends into the wrappings to secure them. No buttons or pins needed, yet they stay firm even during intense activity. These simple strips serve a vital purpose. They add extra warmth to your calves, protect your trousers from being torn by brambles or soaked by mud and snow, and even provide some muscle support during long journeys. It's an ingenious, practical design, the hardiest item in Viking fashion. Finally, you pull on thick leather boots, lined with soft hay, and a pair of woolen socks made with nail binding, an ancient weaving technique older than knitting. Using a single large needle to knot yarn into loops, nail binding creates socks as thick as felt, almost indestructible. Then you drape a heavy woolen cloak over your shoulders, its edges trimmed with fox fur, fastened at the neck with a bronze disc brooch. You put on a sheepskin hat and tuck your hands into fingerless woolen gloves. You're ready. You take a deep breath and push open the door. The bitter wind hits you instantly, but you feel like you're wearing a suit of armor. From the inside out, linen, wool, leg wrappings, leather, fur. Each layer has a purpose, forming a precise personal temperature control system. To modernize, this outfit might seem clunky, but it embodies thousands of years of wisdom, hard-won by the Norse in their struggle against a harsh nature. Every thread, every piece of leather is more than just clothing. They are tools for survival, shields against the beast of winter. You step out of the longhouse into a sea of white, feeling like a moving fortress, warm and safe. As evening falls, the daily work in the longhouse pauses. People gather around the central hearth, preparing to enjoy the most important meal of the day. The smell of stewed meat grows stronger, mixed with some strange sour and smoky aromas that you've never smelled before. This is the true flavor of the Viking winter table, a taste cooked up by both wisdom and scarcity. A woman uses a long wooden spoon to ladle a bowl of steaming food from a large iron pot. You take it, seeing a thick porridge-like mixture, darker than oatmeal, with chunks of meat and unrecognizable root vegetables. This is scores, a Viking-style one-pot stew. The pot stays over the fire all day, its contents constantly eaten and refilled. A rabbit from today's hunt, a few turnips dug up from the cellar, even leftover bones, all simmered until every bit of nutrition and flavor is extracted into the broth. It's a simple, rough method, but it maximizes every ingredient, wasting no calories. You scoop a piece of meat into your mouth, expecting the rich taste of stew, but are hit by a strong sourness. The meat is tender, but its flavor is unusual, like it's been pickled in vinegar. You look confusedly at a man nearby who is eating heartily. He notices your confusion and laughs loudly. "That's way good stuff," he says. You realize this is one of the Vikings' unique methods of preserving meat. In summer and autumn, when meat was more abundant, they would cook it, then place it in large wooden barrels or clay pots, filling them with whey, a byproduct of cheese making, rich in lactic acid. In a sealed container, the lactic acid acts as a natural preservative, preventing the meat from spoiling and making its texture unusually tender. This whey-cured meat could last for months, becoming a vital source of protein in winter. To you, it might be an unpalatable dark cuisine, but to the Vikings, that sour taste was the taste of security and vitality. Besides the sour meat, your bowl has a few pieces of dark dried fish cod, caught and cleaned in autumn, then hung on outdoor wooden frames to dry in the sharp, dry northern wind, turning into fish so hard it's like wood. Before eating, it needs to be beaten repeatedly with a wooden hammer to loosen the fibers, then boiled in the pot or torn apart to eat. Its texture is tough, its saltiness and umami concentrated, filling your mouth with flavor as you chew. As you eat, you see someone on the other side of the hearth take a long, dark object down from the roof beams, cut off a piece, and throw it into the pot. It's a leg of lamb, naturally smoked in the upper part of the longhouse, using the hearth smoke. Without a chimney, the smoke lingers below the roof before escaping, creating a natural smokehouse. All meat needing long-term preservation is hung there, slowly cured by the smoke and fire, until it becomes flavorful smoked meat. You look around, watching people eat these smoked, dried, and sour preserved foods. Suddenly, you realize the entire Viking winter diet is a war against spoilage. They use every method: smoke, fire, sourness, even freezing, to slow the hands of time, sealing the abundance of summer and autumn to fight the scarcity of winter. Night has long fallen, but life in the longhouse is far from over. In fact, for many, the longest and most focused work of the day is just beginning. You finish your uniquely flavored dinner and find an empty spot on a bench. You thought the rest of the evening would be for resting and chatting. But you soon realize that idleness is a luxury here. Hardly anyone's hands are still. A middle-aged woman beside you, the mistress of the house, hands you a wooden tool that looks like a top and a fluffy ball of wool. With simple gestures, she demonstrates. Hold a small tuft of wool fibers in your left hand. Twist the wooden rod with your right, making it spin like a top. Under centrifugal force, the small wooden disc drives the rod to spin continuously, magically stretching and twisting the wool fibers in your hand into a continuous thread. This is a drop spindle, the primary tool for making yarn for thousands of years. You imitate her awkwardly, failing at first. The yarn is either too thick or too thin, or it snaps just as you get the hang of it. The mistress patiently adjusts your hands, telling you to control the speed of the fiber with your left hand and keep the spindle spinning steadily with your right. You slowly find your rhythm, watching the wool turn into yarn in your fingers, a strange sense of accomplishment welling up in your chest. This seemingly simple action is incredibly time-consuming. As you look around, nearly all the women, from the grey-haired elderly to the 7 or 8-year-old girls, are repeating this motion. Their spindles spin rapidly in the dim firelight, like tireless spirits dancing. Behind this endless swinging is the astonishing demand for textiles in the Viking Age. The clothes on your back, the blankets you sleep under, even the sails of their proud longships, all require an astronomical amount of yarn. Samoan does the math for you. To weave an ordinary woolen tunic, from shearing the wool to spinning the yarn, weaving the cloth, and sewing it together, a skilled woman would need to put in nearly 400 hours of work. Spinning is the most time-consuming part. Legend has it that to keep up with one weaver, 7 spinners would need to work at the same time. Even more astonishing are the sails. You saw the longships moored along the shore during the day. Their sails are enormous. To weave a single large woolen sail strong enough to withstand sea storms requires the entire fleece of 200 to 400 sheep. Behind that is thousands, even tens of thousands, of hours of labor. So all winter, the women in the longhouse are making the most basic and important preparations for the spring voyages. The spindles in their hands are, in effect, providing the fundamental power for the Viking Age's expansion. The warriors who brave the seas owe their ability to sail far and wide to the countless spindles spinning silently in the cold winter nights back home. The men are not idle either. They aren't spinning, but they're just as busy preparing for the coming year. Some sit together, carefully sharpening their axes, spearheads, and swords on whetstones, the firelight glinting off the blades, reflecting their focused faces. Others repair farm tools, replacing the wooden handles of hoes or weaving new nets. In one corner, a man sits before a piece of wood, using a small knife and chisel to carve meticulously. He's making a wooden box, its surface already covered with complex, flowing lines, animals and mythical figures intertwined, leaving almost no blank space. You lower your head and continue spinning your yarn. In this warm, crowded longhouse, time seems to lose its meaning. The line between day and night blurs. Only the dancing of the hearth fire and the never-ending work in people's hands define each passing moment. Winter is not a season of stagnation, but a season of gathering strength. Every sharpening, every twist of yarn, every carving is pouring tangible power into the spring's renewal and the future's expeditions. Today, an important guest has come to the longhouse, the Jarl, or chieftain, of the neighboring region. His arrival transforms the noisy, casual atmosphere into one of order, making you feel the rigid hierarchy of the society. For the first time, the Jarl is tall and imposing, with long golden hair combed neatly and a beard braided into intricate plaits. He wears a deep blue woolen cloak trimmed with fur, fastened at the neck with a large silver brooch, and a heavy silver arm ring adorns his wrist. As soon as he enters the longhouse, everyone stops working, standing up to greet him respectfully. The master of the house, a carl or freeman, hurries forward, respectfully leading him to the high seat, the most honored spot in the center of the benches, usually occupied by the head of the household. Behind the seat stand two intricately carved posts, called high posts, symbolizing the family's honor and the master's authority. Now the master gives this seat to the jarl, sitting beside him instead. After the jarl sits, his followers, a group of elite warriors, occupy the seats around him, forming a protective circle. You and the other ordinary carls sit on benches farther from the high seat. The thralls, or slaves, have no right to sit on the benches at all. They stand in the corners or squat by the hearth, adding firewood, waiting for their master's orders at any moment. Their clothes are usually undyed, rough linen, their hair cut short, their faces wearing expressions of obedience, even apathy. This stark class division is not just a temporary formality, but the cornerstone of the Viking worldview. In their creation myth, the Lay of Rig, the god Rig disguises himself and visits three couples, thereby creating three social classes. First, he visits a grandfather and grandmother living in a humble hut, eating meager food. Their descendants are the thralls, described in the myth as black-haired, ugly, and thick-ankled. Next, he visits a grandfather and grandmother living in a sturdy house, eating delicious food. Their descendants are the carls, described as red-haired, red-faced, and strong. Finally, he visits a father and mother living in a grand mansion, feasting on delicacies. Their descendants are the jarls, described as fair-haired, blue-eyed, with eyes as sharp as snakes. This myth is more a declaration of the legitimacy of social order than a history. It tells everyone that class is innate, a reflection of the god's will. As you look at the fair-haired, blue-eyed jarl, then at the dark-skinned, stocky thralls in the corner, you can't help but admit that the myth seems to find an unsettling echo in reality. In the small longhouse, this hierarchy is amplified. Who gets to sit closest to the fire, the warmest spot? Who gets the best piece of meat from the stew first? Who do people listen to carefully when they speak? Whose jokes get laughs and agreement? All these small daily interactions constantly confirm and reinforce everyone's social status. For the jarl, winter is the perfect time to patrol his lands and consolidate his authority. He visits the homes of free men, accepting their allegiance and gifts, mediating disputes, arranging marriages, ensuring his network of rule remains strong before spring arrives. Of course, scholars have long debated how rigid this system was. Some argue that Viking society had a degree of mobility. A brave carl, a wealthy merchant, might have a chance to rise in status, even becoming a local leader. After all, early military leaders were chosen for their combat prowess, but others believe this mobility existed more in the imagination of heroic epics. In reality, class barriers, especially the gulf between slaves and free men, were nearly insurmountable. A thrall's fate was almost determined from the moment they were born. The Jarl and the Master begin discussing matters of land and livestock. Their voices deep and powerful, dominating the conversation in the Longhouse. You sit far away, sipping mead from your bowl. In this seemingly warm, united community, invisible walls have long divided people clearly. The hearth fire warms everyone's bodies, but the warmth each person feels is not the same. Winter did not make people more equal. Instead, it made this inequality more concrete and undeniable in the daily close contact. In one corner of the Longhouse near the livestock pen is the children's territory. Despite the world outside being covered in ice and snow, the vitality here is undiminished. You watch these young Vikings with interest, realizing their world is a miniature version of the adult world, full of imitation, learning, and preparation for the future. You see two boys, about 7 or 8 years old, having a fierce duel with two small wooden sticks as swords. Their movements are clumsy, but their eyes are extremely focused, and they mimic the shouts and cries of men in battle. In Viking society, boys were encouraged to be competitive from an early age. Fighting was not punished. Instead, it was seen as a necessary way to cultivate courage and combat skills. The wooden swords in their hands may be toys, but they are the first step toward picking up real iron swords to defend their homes or sail on expeditions in the future. Not far away, a younger girl sits on a fur, holding a simple doll made of cloth scraps and wood. She hums softly while pretending to feed the doll with a small wooden stick. Beside her lies a palm-sized stone quern, a miniature version of the real thing. She picks up a few dried wild plums, drops them into the quern's hole, and turns the top stone with a serious expression, crushing the fruit. The discovery of these toy querns has fascinated later scholars. It shows that even tedious, heavy household chores like grinding grain were internalized into children's games. As the girl plays house, she is unconsciously learning the skills she will need as a housewife in the future. Viking children had no schools in the modern sense. Their education was fully integrated into daily life and work. Girls learned spinning, weaving, cooking, and cheese, making from their mothers. Boys learned farming, herding, tool repair, and most importantly, combat from their fathers. Their games were their classrooms. A child who could skillfully row a toy boat might grow up to be an excellent sailor. A child who could hit a target with a toy bow and arrow might one day have success in hunting. You watch the children, sometimes imitating adults in serious work games, sometimes bursting into pure, unprovoked laughter and chasing each other. Their childhood may not have been as carefree as we imagine, full of hardships and responsibilities. But the instinct for play and joy still found a way to grow in this cold land. In the dim corners of the Longhouse, their kingdom was half a rehearsal for reality, half a flight of imagination together. They formed the most real and resilient childhood scene of that era. Today is Saturday. In modern society, this usually means rest and entertainment. But in your Viking Longhouse, this day has a more important sacred purpose: bathing. You might be surprised, after all. Most people imagine Vikings as unkempt, dirty barbarians, but today you will witness a surprising truth. These people were far more particular about personal hygiene than you might think, even standing out as unusual among their European contemporaries. Early in the morning, the longhouse is filled with damp steam. People clear a large space beside a hearth, and several large wooden barrels and basins are brought over. Men carry buckets of cold river water from outside, then use wooden tongs to drop red-hot stones from the fire into the water. With a hissing sound, the water boils instantly, and thick steam fills the space. This is the Viking water heater, simple, efficient, and quick to heat. Soon the water reaches a comfortable temperature, and people take turns entering this temporary bathroom. They remove their thick clothes and scrub their bodies with a rough soap made from animal fat and wood ash. The conditions are simple: no private bathroom, everyone washing in full view. But everyone seems calm and unembarrassed. For them, this was not just about cleaning their bodies, but an important social activity. People chat while washing, exchanging the latest news and gossip. You notice that almost everyone, men and women alike, wears a small leather pouch or metal tube on their belt containing their personal grooming kit, a finely crafted comb, usually made of antler or bone, often carved with patterns, a small pair of tweezers for plucking excess hair, and a tiny ear pick. Archaeologists have found a large number of these grooming tools in Viking burial sites and settlements, showing that keeping clean was a common social norm, not just a privilege of the upper class. However, there are two sides to every story. Another observer who had contact with the Vikings, the 10th century Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, gave the exact opposite assessment. He called the Rus Vikings, Vikings settled in Eastern Europe, the dirtiest of Allah's creatures. He described how, although they washed their faces and combed their hair every morning, they all shared a single basin of water. One person washed, then the next, never changing the water. This disgusted him deeply. So were the Vikings' clean-cut heartthrobs or unhygienic slobs. The question remains unresolved. One possibility is that hygiene habits varied among different Viking groups. A more likely explanation is that this reflects a cultural conflict in the definition of cleanliness. For Ibn Fadlan, private, individual washing was a mark of civilization. The Vikings' open communal bathing seemed barbaric and dirty to him. You finish your bath, put on clean clothes, and feel refreshed. You sit back by the hearth, carefully combing your still damp hair with a borrowed ancient comb. You begin to understand the significance of this commitment to cleanliness in the long, oppressive winter. It was not just about hygiene, but a ritual to maintain order and dignity. In the ancient poem Vamal, there is this advice: a man should wash himself every day, eat and drink his fill before going out, for you never know where you will be when night falls. To the Vikings, fate was unpredictable, and death could come at any moment. Therefore, a person must always maintain their dignity. ready to face the gods and ancestors in their best form at any time. Keeping clean was a way to take responsibility for oneself and a basic respect for the unknown fate. In the longhouse at night, besides spinning, repairing, and chatting, there is another, more mentally demanding form of entertainment. You see two men sitting cross-legged on either side of a checkered wooden board near the hearth, their expressions focused as if the noise around them doesn't exist. They are playing a board game called flavorful, often translated as King's Table or Viking Chess. Curious, you lean in to watch. The board is an 11 times 11 grid with a larger distinct piece in the center, the king. Around the king are 12 white defender pieces, while 24 black attacker pieces line the four sides of the board. It is a classic asymmetric strategy game. The defender's goal is to escort the king to any of the four corners of the board, while the numerically superior attacker's only goal is to surround and capture the king. This game was extremely popular in the Viking world, from Scandinavia to their settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even the British Isles. Archaeologists have found flavorful boards and pieces. It was more than just a way to pass the time. It was considered a simulator of military strategy during the long winter months when they were not sailing to raid. Playing flavorful kept warriors' tactical thinking sharp. How to fight against superior numbers, how to protect key figures, how to break a siege, how to set traps. These were all crucial skills on the real battlefield. In a sense, every Viking who indulged in flavorful on winter nights was engaged in a war game without bloodshed. As you watch intently, an old man beside you whispers a strange discovery about the game. In the Birka burial ground in Sweden, there is a famous Valkyrie's grave. The tomb's occupant was a woman, but her burial goods were a full set of elite warrior equipment: sword, axe, spear, and shield. Most notably, a complete set of flavorful pieces was placed on her legs as if she was ready to play a game in the afterlife. This discovery shocked the archaeological world. It not only challenged the traditional view of Viking society as strictly divided between men's and women's roles, men fighting, women managing the home, but also made people rethink the significance of flavorful. It may not have been just a male military game. It could also have been a way for women to participate in strategic decision-making and demonstrate their wisdom. The atmosphere in the longhouse tonight is different from usual. Less daily noise, more expectant calm, because a special guest has arrived, a skald or poet. He looks no different from an ordinary traveler, dressed simply, his face lined with wind and frost. But when he is invited to the high seat by the master, clears his throat, and prepares to speak, the entire longhouse falls silent. Everyone puts down their work, their eyes fixed on him intently. In an era without books or the internet, the skald was a living history, a walking library, the most important inheritor of Viking culture. He had no musical accompaniment. His only tool was his voice. He began to speak, his voice not loud, but with a strange rhythm and power that instantly captured everyone's attention. He chanted not simple stories, but an extremely complex form of poetry called court poetry. This poetic form had strict meters, with precise rules for the number of syllables, stress positions, alliteration, and internal rhyme in each line. Even if you couldn't understand all the words, you could feel the musicality and rhythm of the language. What confused and fascinated you even more was his use of language. He rarely called things by their direct names, instead using imaginative, roundabout metaphors. The sea was the whale's road, battle was the storm of swords, a generous chieftain was the destroyer of gold, and a warrior was the feeder of ravens. Since ravens pecked at the bodies on the battlefield, this unique rhetorical device was called a kenning. A kenning usually consists of two words, a base word and a modifier, combined like a tiny riddle that requires the listener to draw on their mythological and historical knowledge to solve. For example, when the poet mentioned Frodi's misfortune or the slave's flower, everyone present smiled knowingly. They all knew this referred to gold. Behind this was a myth. King Frodi had a magic mill that could grind anything. Greedy, he forced two giantess slaves to grind gold for him day and night. Eventually, the giantesses grew tired of it and ground out an army, destroying Frodi's kingdom. Thus, the mill's product became a metaphor for gold. This highly intellectual poetry was not just for entertainment. It had two important social functions. First, it was a symbol of status. Understanding these complex kennings meant having profound cultural literacy, a mark of nobility and elites at the time. Second, it was a tool for legitimizing power. Skalds were usually employed by kings and chieftains, and their main job was to compose praise poems, singing the praises of their patrons' achievements. When a chieftain's name was woven into poems alongside these kennings from ancient myths, his rule was seemingly connected to the deeds of the gods, thus gaining sanctity and legitimacy. The skald's chant continued, his voice rising and falling, drawing everyone into an ancient world of glory and tragedy, built with words. In the long, dark winter nights, these stories were people's most important spiritual food. They connected the past and the present, uniting a scattered community trapped in the Longhouse into a nation with shared memories and identity. The firelight might only illuminate the small Longhouse, but the skald's voice could light up the hearts of the entire Viking world. Days passed, the days growing shorter, the nights deeper and darker. The world outside the Longhouse seemed shrouded in eternal twilight. Just as the darkness and cold reached their peak, a grand celebration ignited the entire Longhouse. Yule, the most important festival of the Viking year, a multi-day carnival to fight darkness and welcome new life. The festival's prelude was opened by a huge log. Men joined forces to drag a carefully selected oak, or ash log, large enough to burn for days into the Longhouse, placing it in the hearth. This was the Yule log. When it was lit, the flames instantly illuminated every corner of the house, dispelling the cold and darkness. In the days that followed, this fire would never go out. It symbolized the warmth of the sun and the power of life, the firmest hope for people in the long winter. With the lighting of the Yule log, the feast began. A temporary long table was set up in the center of the longhouse, piled high with food. Besides the daily stew and dried fish, there was roasted meat, rarely seen on ordinary days. The air was filled with the aroma of roasted pork and spices. More importantly, barrels of newly brewed Yule mead were brought out. According to the laws of the time, every free man was required to drink a certain amount of mead during Yule, or face punishment. This was less a rule and more a mandatory collective carnival, ensuring everyone fully immersed themselves in the festival spirit. People raised their drinking horns, starting round after round of toasts. The first toast was to Odin, for victory and the king's strength. The second to Njord and Freyr, for harvest and peace. The third to the chieftain present. Later, people would toast to their loved ones who had passed away, buried in the nearby hills. This was called the Toast of Remembrance on Yule, a special time when the line between the living and the dead blurred. Drinking with ancestors was an important way for the Vikings to seek protection and strength. As the feast reached its climax, an older, more sacred ritual began. Two men carried a lively wild boar into the hall. This was the Boar of Oaths. It was led to the chieftain, and people lined up, placing their hands on its back bristles, then loudly speaking their vows for the coming year. A young warrior swore he would be the first to set foot on the shores of Britain in spring. A farmer swore he would clear a new field. Someone, even emboldened by drink, swore he would marry the chieftain's most beautiful daughter. Oaths made in front of this sacred animal were considered binding beyond measure. They were more than New Year's resolutions. They were contracts pledged with one's honor and life. Once spoken, they had to be fulfilled at all costs. After the ritual, the boar, which carried everyone's hopes and resolutions, was sacrificed to the gods on the spot. Its meat became the most important dish at the feast. Yule was like a carefully planned collective psychotherapy. It used food and alcohol to dispel the fear of cold and hunger, and sacred rituals and solemn oaths to redirect people's attention from their current hardships to a hopeful future. For these days, the Longhouse was no longer a shelter from the storm, but a temple filled with strength and determination. When Yule ended and the days began to grow longer, a seed called spring was planted in everyone's heart. After the hustle and bustle of Yule, the Longhouse returned to its usual calm. But an unspoken anxiety began to linger in the air, like the smoke from the hearth. This winter seemed unusually long. Several lambs in the livestock pen had fallen ill, and a young man who went hunting had accidentally broken his leg. A series of misfortunes made people wonder if some invisible force was at work. So, after consulting with the elders, they decided to invite a Volva, or Ceres, to perform a Sidra magic ritual to divine the future's fortune. A few days later, the Volva arrived at a Longhouse. She was an old woman, her face lined with wrinkles, but her eyes sharp, as if she could see into people's souls. She wore a deep blue cloak and a hat made of black lambskin and white sable fur. Most striking was the long wooden staff in her hand, topped with brass and gems, a key tool for her magic. Her arrival made the atmosphere in the Longhouse solemn and tense. People built a higher platform on the master's high seat for her, allowing her to overlook everyone. The ritual began at night. The vulva climbed onto the platform and sat down, while her several young female assistants gathered below. At the vulva's signal, the girls began to sing an ancient, monotonous song, ethereal and distant, echoing in the smoky longhouse, as if calling to distant gods. As the song continued, the vulva's body began to sway slightly, her breathing quickening, her eyes growing unfocused. She entered a trance, or as the Vikings believed, an out-of-body experience. In Viking ideology, the core of Sidra magic was the practitioner separating their soul from their body, allowing it to travel through time and space to uncover the secrets of the past or glimpse the fate of the future. At this point, the master of the house stepped forward, respectfully asking the vulva the question weighing on everyone's minds. How much longer would the winter last? Would the sick livestock recover? Would the injured young man heal? The vulva did not answer directly. Instead, she began to mutter vague, fragmented words, as if relaying messages from another world. Her assistants listened closely, trying to interpret these oracles into understandable language. You stood in the crowd, holding your breath, watching. You noticed that the men present, even the bravest warriors, wore expressions mixed with awe and a hint of unease, because Sidra was considered an entirely female art in Viking society. A man who studied or practiced Sidra would be seen as effeminate, even perverted. In the epic Lokasenna, the flighting of Loki, when Loki wanted to infuriate Odin, the Allfather, his most vicious insult was mocking Odin for secretly practicing Sidra like a witch. This reflected a deep gender ideology in Viking society. Men should solve problems and gain glory through direct, open, and honorable means. Magic, especially Sidra, an indirect, mysterious way of manipulating reality through spiritual power and illusions, was seen as the domain of women. Yet, paradoxically, Odin, the paragon of masculinity, was also the most powerful magic user in mythology. This seemed to suggest that even the strongest male power sometimes had to rely on female power to cope with the complexity and unpredictability of the world. The ritual on the platform continued. Finally, the vulva's body trembled violently, and she snapped out of her trance. Her assistants relayed the interpreted oracle to everyone. The winter would end soon. The sick livestock would recover, but the young man would need a longer time to heal. Although the answer was somewhat ambiguous, people's faces clearly showed relief. What they needed was not necessarily a definite answer, but confirmation and comfort from the supernatural world. After receiving generous payment, the vulva left quietly, and the tense atmosphere in the longhouse dissipated. You looked at the hearth, filled with awe for this world. Here, the line between reality and myth, reason and magic was blurred. Under the weight of the long winter, people needed not only food and warmth to sustain their bodies, but also such mysterious rituals to soothe their hearts. Fearful of the unknown on an ordinary afternoon, the Longhouse was relatively quiet, most people busy with their own work. Suddenly, a heated argument broke the calm. You turned to look and saw two men, Bjorn and Eric, red in the face, accusing each other. The cause was simple. Bjorn claimed that Eric had borrowed a newly forged axe from him the previous week to chop wood. But when he returned it, there was a clear chip in the blade. Eric firmly denied it, saying he had used it carefully and returned it in perfect condition. The chip must have been caused by Bjorn himself. An axe was an extremely valuable possession at the time, and the dispute involved the honor of two free men, quickly becoming tricky. People gathered around, the atmosphere growing tense. In Viking society, which valued honor above all else, failure to resolve such accusations properly could escalate from words to bloodshed. Just as tensions rose, the master of the house, also the leader of this small community, whom we'll call Harold, stood up from his high seat. He did not shout. Instead, he walked calmly between the two men and said in a deep voice, "Come to the hearth and tell your story in front of everyone." A temporary court was thus formed in the center of the Longhouse, beside the hearth. This was the epitome of the Viking legal system. They had no permanent courts or professional judges. Most legal matters were handled at public assemblies called things, where all free men participated in the decision-making. Now, this small Longhouse became the most basic miniature thing. Bjorn spoke first, describing in detail how sharp his axe was, how perfect it was before he lent it, and how angry he was when he found the chip. Then Eric defended himself, swearing he had not damaged the axe, and suggesting Bjorn might be trying to extort him. After listening to both sides, Harold turned to the onlookers and asked, "Did anyone see what happened?" This was another feature of Viking law, great emphasis on witness testimony. A young man named Olaf stepped forward and said, "I saw Eric hurrying when he returned the axe, as if he was trying to avoid Bjorn." This testimony, though not directly proving Eric damaged the axe, put him at a disadvantage. Harold paused, then made his ruling. He did not try to figure out who exactly caused the chip. This was no longer provable. Instead, he adopted a more practical, distinctly Viking solution. "Eric," he said, "you failed to take good care of the borrowed item, causing your neighbor loss and suspicion. That is your fault. Bjorn, you accused your neighbor without conclusive evidence, which harms harmony. Here is my judgment. Eric, you will compensate Bjorn with 2 chickens for the potential damage to his axe. Bjorn, you will accept these 2 chickens, and the matter ends here. Shake hands and drink a cup of mead together." The core of this judgment was not punishment, but compensation. That was the essence of Viking law. In their legal system, almost all crimes, from theft to assault, even murder, could be resolved by paying a customary fine. The amount of compensation depended on the victim's social status and the severity of the harm. For example, knocking out a free man's tooth might require paying a sum of silver, while killing a jarl could cost a family their entire fortune. The purpose of this system was not to achieve absolute justice, but to restore the broken social balance and avoid endless blood feuds. Although both Bjorn and Eric were reluctant, under the leader's authority and the gaze of everyone, they finally accepted the ruling. Eric went home to fetch 2 chickens for Bjorn, and the two shook hands in Harold's presence, then drank a cup of mead together, albeit reluctantly. A potential violent conflict was resolved without bloodshed. You watched the calm return to the Longhouse. In a society without police or prisons, order was maintained by a complex system rooted in community, honor, and economic compensation. Especially in winter, when dozens or hundreds of people were confined together in this small space, conflicts and frictions could erupt at any time. This flexible, pragmatic legal wisdom was like an invisible rope, holding this fiery-tempered community together, preventing it from falling apart due to internal strife before spring arrived. Winter's grip began to loosen. The days grew noticeably longer, and the faint, pale sunlight that once barely peeked over the horizon now lingered a little longer each morning, painting the snow-covered meadow in soft gold. The wind, though still sharp, lost its brutal bite. It no longer howled like a beast, but sighed, as if exhausted from its long reign over the land. You step outside one morning, and for the first time in months, you don't feel the cold cutting through your layers. Instead, it nips gently at your cheeks, a reminder that change is coming. The snow around the Longhouse has started to melt, forming small puddles that glisten in the sunlight. The once towering pile of firewood beside the door has shrunk, its last few logs now crackling softly in the hearth. No longer a desperate lifeline, but a comforting companion. The livestock, too, seem to sense the shift. The sheep leap more cheerfully, and the cows nudge at the door, eager to step into the weak but warm sunlight. Inside the Longhouse, the air feels lighter, less thick with smoke and the weight of confinement. The women's spinning wheels still hum, but their rhythm is brighter, faster. They're weaving lighter fabrics now, preparing for the milder days ahead. The men have stopped sharpening their axes for battle and turned to mending plows and repairing the longships, which have been anchored in the frozen harbor all winter. The ice around the ships is thawing too, cracking with soft, creaking sounds that echo across the water, a melody of renewal. Only in morning, you wake to a sound you haven't heard in months, the chirping of birds. They flit about the roof of the Longhouse, their songs sharp and clear, cutting through the last of the winter stillness. You step outside, and the world feels different, softer, warmer. The snow has retreated to the shadows, leaving patches of damp, dark earth exposed. Tiny green shoots peek through the soil near the Longhouse door, fragile but determined, pushing their way toward the sun. This is the first sign of spring, the promise you've all been waiting for. The mood in the Longhouse shifts entirely. The quiet, steady resolve of winter gives way to a gentle excitement. Children run outside, barefoot in the slush, much to their mother's chagrin, chasing the birds and poking at the new shoots. Women gather baskets and head to the edge of the woods, searching for early wild berries and tender herbs, fresh food, a welcome break from the smoked and preserved fare of winter. Men take turns breaking the last of the ice in the nearby stream, clearing a path for the fish that will soon swim upstream. You join a group of men as they unload the longships, scraping away the last bits of ice and checking the hulls for damage. The wood, stiff from the cold, creaks as they move it, but it's sound ready to carry them out to sea once more. A young warrior, the one who broke his leg earlier in the winter, leans on a crutch nearby, watching with a grin. His leg is still weak, but he's eager to join the first fishing trip of the season. Soon, he says, nodding toward the water, we'll bring back cod and herring, enough to feed the whole clan. No more dried fish for a while. You smile, knowing he's right. The winter's scarcity is fading, replaced by the promise of abundance. The fuel bricks are nearly gone. The firewood pile is empty, but no one minds soon. They'll be able to gather fresh wood from the woods, and the hearth will burn not for survival, but for comfort. That evening, the longhouse is filled with a different kind of warmth. Instead of the heavy stews of winter, the hearth simmers with a light broth made from fresh herbs and the first fish caught that day. The air smells of spring earth, greenery, and the faint salt of the sea. People laugh more freely now, their voices lighter, as they talk about the months ahead, planting crops, sailing to trade, visiting neighboring clans. The skald, who has stayed through the winter, stands once more by the hearth. But his chant is different now. It's not a song of survival or legend, but of renewal, of the sun returning, the earth waking, and the cycle beginning again. His words weave through the longhouse, mixing with the crackle of the fire and the laughter of the children, and for a moment you feel the weight of the long winter lift completely. As night falls, you step outside again. The sky is clear, dotted with stars, and the wind carries the sweet scent of blooming buds. The long winter is over. It was a season of struggle, of closeness, of wisdom forged in cold and darkness. But it was also a season of immunity, of hope, of holding on together. You look back at the longhouse, its windows, those ancient wind eyes, glowing with warm light. Inside, people are settling down to sleep, tired but content. They've survived the cold, the dark, the scarcity, and they've done it together. That, you realize, is the true secret of the Vikings' winter survival. Not just dung bricks or woolen clothes, not just stew or mead, but the strength of a community bound by shared hardship, shared hope, and shared stories. The stars twinkle above, and the world is quiet, but it's a quiet full of life. Spring is here, and with it, new beginnings. But the memory of the winter, the warmth of the hearth, the hum of the spinning wheels, the skald song, the feel of wool against your skin will linger. A reminder of what can be endured when people stand together. And now, as the night grows calm, let that memory wrap around you like a warm fur blanket. Let the sound of the hearth fire, the soft breathing of the clan, and the gentle rustle of spring leaves lull you to sleep. Tomorrow the work of spring will begin. But tonight, rest. You've earned it. Good night, friends. Sleep well. And remember, even the longest, coldest winter gives way to spring.